Hey, it's Chris and Gena Maselli. We are streaming live again because we are going to record another podcast. We're going to be coming out with a podcast here in probably a couple months or so, and we're just wanting to get a few of these recorded so that we can make them all live and have a little bit of a buffer. So welcome if you're joining us live. We're still learning as we go, so pardon the dust. But I think this is going to be good.
Yeah.
All right, welcome to the podcast. This is Christopher Maselli.
And Gena Maselli.
And we've got some good stories today that we're going to talk about. Gena, what you got?
Okay, the first one we're going to talk about today is Jerry Seinfeld's 5-step comedy writing process. And this is what a great article.
That's fun.
It is by Jess Zafaris from Writer's Digest.
That's right. And she went to the Gotham Comedy Club in New York City, right? And to her surprise, guess who showed up on the stage?
Yeah, Jerry Seinfeld made a surprise appearance. And so, but at the end of his set, I guess someone from the audience asked him about his writing process. It was probably an aspiring comic.
That's right.
And so he talked about it. And so she was able to capture that. And that's a real gem.
So
I love it.
This is how he comes up with his own comedy material. So this is a great article. We'll have a link to it. But why don't we just go ahead and we can talk about what the 5 steps are, and then we can talk a little bit about each one more in depth.
Okay. So step number 1, start with a funny topic.
Right. And then step number 2 is think of emotions and images around the funny topic to come up with more jokes.
Number 3 is assemble the jokes logically and connect them.
And then number 4 is compress the jokes and adjust the pacing.
And step 5 is test out the jokes in smaller groups.
Always test.
Yeah, always test.
Yeah, that's good.
So what I loved about this article is that even though this is talking about comedy writing, I think that there's a lot here that applies to any writing, no matter what you're doing.
Yeah, it really does. Like the first one, to start with a funny topic, he talks about brainstorming ideas, that you find funny or interesting and see where they take you. Well, when I write novels, I've written some kids novels. And when I write those, I brainstorm just by putting a bunch of boxes down on paper, and I think, okay, what's something that's like that one? And I'll just start to branch out and try to come up with better and better ideas as I go. And that's really what it's about, is find funny or interesting stories and just see where they take you. And that's what he does with comedy.
Well, and for me to apply this to magazine writing or to article writing, even this morning as I was getting ready, I had my phone there and I had my notes app open, and I was kind of just thinking about a certain topic. And I probably wrote about 4 or 5 different titles and angles of that same topic. So looking at it from those different directions, looking at it from those different angles, I think, like I said, you can apply that whether you're writing comedy, whether you're writing a novel, or whether you're writing articles.
Yeah, you'll hear so many writers talk about how they keep a small notebook with them or a small pad of paper, and every time they see something that sparks an idea, they'll write it down in there to keep all their ideas together, because you're always looking for good ideas. And I like to use like Evernote on my phone because I don't carry a notebook with me, but I always have my phone with me. So I open up Evernote, and if I see something that might spark an idea, I might make a note of it there in Evernote, and I've got my ideas always ready to go.
Well, and I heard Christy Johnson, one of our friends, say one time that she uses her recorder on her phone.
Oh yeah,
so that especially in the middle of the night, if she wakes up and she's got an idea, she's constantly, she's got it close by, and she can then transcribe it later. So, man,
that is a great thing about technology today, is that you can do that kind of thing. I've told the story before about how one time I was out jogging, and a lot of times when you're jogging, you get ideas in your mind, and I wasn't sure, how do I write this stuff down, because I thought, gee, if I wait till I get home, I'm not going to remember. And Evernote has an audio feature on it where it will transcribe your words that you record audibly. It also has one that I think would just records the audio. But I did that as I was running. I recorded what I had in my mind, and then when I got home, I had to transcribe me half breathless, with this idea.
Was that on your phone?
Yeah, I did it right on my phone. And you can
Okay.
do it on your watch too, I think, nowadays. So
Okay.
it's technology.
Okay. Well, the other thing that he mentioned in this that I thought was great is often rely on relatability. And so what Jess had written in here is relatability will draw the audience in and make them more sympathetic to your characters, while surprising circumstances and creative language keep them turning pages. And so I think it goes back to looking at things differently. And another friend of ours, Renee Gutteridge, just wrote, it's been a few months, but she wrote a blog on that she called Flipping the Script. And she does a lot of humor writing, which I love to hear. If you ever get a chance to hear her speak, she's great at speaking, and I love her Boo series. But she talked about that, flipping the script and not looking at something just from communicating it, not just telling the story just the way the audience necessarily expects it to go, but looking at that situation from a different angle and telling it from that different angle. So that kind of made me think of that Flip the Script blog, and we'll put a link to that below as well.
That's good, but it's relatable. Always be relatable.
Always being
That's
relatable.
Good. I really like the step 3 he had, which is assemble the jokes logically and connect them. This is something I love about the writing that Dave Barry does, the humor columnist for the Florida newspaper. Which one is it?
Isn't it Miami?
I think it's Miami. Anyway, a lot of times if you'll read his columns, he will reference something near the end of the column that he set up as a joke in the beginning of the column. And you can do that as you're writing books too. I like to take, when I'm writing a book, and if there's something that I mention toward the end of the book in the third act, I will go back and purposefully in the first act insert a seed about that item so that the reader gets this feeling as they're reading through that you had made that connection, all along, when really it was purposely put in there. But it makes for a really rich reading experience when you see those connections all the way through the material.
I saw you did that even in a memoir that we were working on last year. That it was
a ghostwritten memoir.
It was a ghostwritten memoir. And I remember we both were reading it, but you were looking for that thread that could go through the entire. So it wasn't just, I'm going to tell my story. This is when I was born, and this is what happened to me, and here's something else that happened, and it was actually a thread that went back to the beginning, and it really gave the whole book just such a deeper.
Yeah, you could do that even with phrases. A character might say something in, let's say, the second act, and you think, oh, that's a really good phrase, and you can insert that in the first act and in the third act and make it feel, again, like it's a repetitive something, especially if it's a joke. It can be very funny, especially in different situations, right? If you like movies, the movie Back to the Future does this a lot, where they will take a single joke and it will repeat in different situations, and in that series, even different time periods. But it's the same joke, but they're repeating it again and again, and even throughout the trilogy they do that in order to create this feeling that the whole thing is connected, even though they did it, at the end after they'd written the script. They probably went back and inserted that all throughout the way, but it really makes for a very clean, very memorable, and fun experience.
I think that's so true. And the next step was compress the jokes and adjust the pacing. And I think this is so interesting. It says at the end, she says, the closer together your jokes, the funnier your scene has the potential to be. But for me, more than just the jokes, which I see exactly what she's talking about here, the pacing in a book or an article or in whatever you're writing is so important.
Yes.
There are times when you just, you don't want to end on that wrong beat. You want to take your reader on a journey with you And you have to be hitting the right pacing throughout.
And the pace will be different for the type of book it is. If you're writing a thriller, like a James Patterson thriller, he might have 3-page chapters throughout the entire book. But if you're writing something that's a slower, romance or something like that, you're going to have longer chapters. The pacing is going to slow down. It all depends on the style of what you're writing.
But I think even for nonfiction, it doesn't just have to be.
Good point.
You still have to have a specific pacing. You don't want to leave your reader dissatisfied for any reason there. And I think one of the best, as you get used to pacing and looking for that pacing, I think it's easier to identify it. But in the beginning, I know one of the easiest ways to identify it is just through reading aloud. Read your article aloud, read your work aloud, and you'll start to hear when something kind of drops off, or when you don't complete a thought, or when it just isn't ending on that right beat.
That's a really good tip, because reading out loud is it sounds different when you read it out loud than when you read it in your head. And that will help you catch so many things, which really goes into his next point, which is testing out the jokes in smaller groups. You want to have other people read what you've written before you start submitting it to agents and that sort of thing, right? Have an editor read it and see how what you've written works for them. Because in the same way that your own voice helps you hear it differently, someone else reading it is going to hear what you've written differently. If you've ever heard someone tell a joke and heard like 3 or 4 people tell the same joke, for some they can tell it and it can be hilarious, and others it can completely fall flat because of the way that they tell or read the joke. And you want to try and guard against that and make sure that it is smooth as possible for as many people as possible. Because it's all about communication. The writing is about communication, and it's got to communicate with the most people as possible.
Absolutely. Well, our next article is a really fun one. It's 10 favorite writing tips from successful authors, and this is by the editors of Writer's Digest. And so I thought this was really fun, and they had some great tips, advice, and so
from writers of all different kinds of material, all different houses. I think rather than go through all these, we're going to encourage you to read the story itself. But Gena, why don't you share one of your favorites? I'll share one of my favorites, and we can do that for a couple of them. What do you think?
One of the ones that struck me is the one by Jeff Sommers, because I kind of came to this conclusion myself on something that I'm working on. And all of a sudden I got to a place where I just felt like I was like swimming upstream with it. And what his advice is, if you find yourself struggling, if writing a scene feels like lifting a heavy object over your head, ask yourself if you're bored. If you're writing it just because you think you have to, the answer is yes, and skip it. And I thought back to this one project that I'm working on, and I got to a place where I just felt like I just couldn't move forward. And so reading that has helped me. I'm probably going to just scrap that whole part.
That's hard to do.
It is.
Elmer Leonard, there's a quote in here from him, and he says, try to leave out the part that readers tend to skip. In other words, skip the boring parts. And it's hard, especially, we mentioned writing a memoir just a moment ago. If you're writing a memoir, you may feel like, I want to include everything, or you may just have a fiction story and you're like, I got this great idea, this great scene, I got to include it. But you know what? If it doesn't keep the reader's attention, you've got to skip the boring parts. Go ahead and cut it. It's all right. It still is something that you as a writer may have needed to write down in order to get the story out, but that doesn't mean you necessarily want to include it in your final manuscript.
Well, and you've told me before, Chris, that with writing fiction, that there has to be a purpose for every scene. That
Absolutely.
It can't just be kind of a fun, even though it might be fun, and this is so hard as writers to cut our copy and to cut our writing, but even if it's fun, if there's not a purpose for it being in the book, if it's not propelling the plot forward, if it's not giving you more information that you need, then it probably needs to go.
And I'll even go a step further than that. If you're writing picture books, every word has to count. If there is a word that isn't necessary in that book, you've got to cut the word, because picture books don't have a lot of words, right? They're only about 32 pages. And so you've got to make sure every single word counts.
Yeah. Wow. Well, looking back at this list, another one, there's two more, but one that I loved was Paula Munyer, A Borrowing of Bones by Minotaur Books. And she said, there's 3 rules that guide my writing process. 1, keep the reader reading. 2, don't get it right, get it written. And 3, writing is rewriting. And I think that is so, so true. And I can't tell you how many new writers that I've come across that they want that first draft done. And that is like, I think one of the biggest lessons in writing is just realizing that you get the first draft done, but then it is all about the writing process. That is where you're really going to make your writing shine.
Writing is rewriting. That, that's part of the reason I'm such an advocate for getting that first draft done, because the first draft, in a lot of ways, is the hardest, because you just have to get all that down on paper. But once you get it done, don't think that you're done. I mean, writing, that's when the writing starts. That's when you will spend hours just reading over what you've done, editing it, changing it, rewriting it. And that's just the process. One of the quotes on here is also from Stephen James, who wrote Snaps from Thomas Nelson. And he talks about how he had to revise the first chapters of his books more than 50 times. Now, have you done that with any of your books? I don't even know if I've done that with any of my books. But, the idea is that it's brutal, but it is absolutely essential. Mm-hmm. You've got to do it, and it'll make your book so much better. Now, that said, I do think that there comes a point when you have to realize it's good enough. Mm-hmm. There comes a point where if you're editing, where you have to say, you know what? This is now good enough. I've got to get this thing out there, because otherwise you can get in this paralysis of never stopping your editing, and your book will never get done. And I always say there's the 2 hardest things for most authors to do. One is to start their book, right? They talk about it, but most writers never start their book. If you've started your book, you've done more than most authors have. But the other thing is you have to finish your book. Most authors never finish their book. They get too caught up in, I've got to keep rewriting, got to keep working on it. And there comes a point where you have to say, now it's good enough. I've got to let it go, and I've got to let the world see it.
That's good. That's really good. I think the last one that I wanted to mention was Persist. And this was by Jordan Rosenfeld, How to Write a Page Turner by Writer's Digest Books. Persist. Talent is no guarantee of success. Persistence is. You can learn to be a better writer. You can write more drafts, take more chances, take more classes, query more agents. If you persist at what you need to become, if you persist at what you need to do to become a published author, you will succeed. And man, persistence it's huge. It is huge.
Consistency. You've got to be consistent with your writing. That's the Darren Hardy wrote about that in The Compound Effect. How you just doing a little bit of writing every day will make you an author. Doing a little bit of whatever habit you want to create every single day will help you become who you want to become. And so that persistence, that consistency is absolutely essential in your writing. And don't forget, and this is in another quote from Zachary Petit, The Essential Guide to Freelance Writing from Writer's Digest Books. He talks about how he keeps a can of WD-40 on his desk to remind himself that if he doesn't write daily, he will get rusty. And you've got to remember that. You got to write all the time. You can't stop writing or you'll get rusty, and it's so much harder to start up again.
Yeah, absolutely. Great article. We will definitely put the link down in the notes below. So take a look at those. And we wanted to ask you, what is your writing tip for other authors, for other writers? Share in the comments below. We want to hear from you. We want to learn from you too. So definitely share. And Chris,
and if you're on Twitter, go ahead and share your favorite writing quote at Writing Momentum. And we'll go ahead and retweet that and get the whole writing community involved in seeing it.
That's good.
All right, today's Q&A is from at Real Maria Mayer 1 on Twitter, and she has written. She said, "There's a company that reached out to me and offered to republish my novel, to send it to requesting publishing houses, put the revised book back on Amazon, do news feeds and other publicity services for $3,000. They would do all of that. That would be my expense to cover the cost of sending the required number of books to them. Have you heard of this type of service, and is it sound in your experience?" What do you think, Gena?
Well, this was I chose this one because I think there's a lot of these types of services out there, and we've actually been in contact with another writer who has used services. I have even used a service before that promised big results
For a publicity service,
for
right?
publicity service that was not big results, not what I expected at all.
Not any results, I don't think, right?
I think there was one or two. And then, so this was a hard one because we know that all of this that you listed here are things that the author can do themselves.
Yeah, and probably not too difficult. So when they offer to republish your novel and send it to the requesting houses, like a lot of these things, if you self-publish your novel, especially this sounds like it's a book that was in print and now you're looking to republish it yourself. If you're going to self-publish your novel, you can do most of that through Amazon for almost no cost at all, like really very little cost. We know people who have self-published books, even print books, through Amazon for as little as $2 a copy, and you could not tell any difference between those books and some books that have been traditionally published. They looked absolutely fantastic. And it didn't cost $3,000. It cost $2 a book. And so I'd encourage you, if you're looking at a service like this, to really figure out what it is that they're going to do for you. Now, something that these services often offer are these things like these publicity services. And there is value in good publicity services.
Yeah.
But the key word there is good.
You can't just throw it. What happens often is they will promise you, well, we're going to put it on this site, or we're going to put it on this feed, or we're going to put it in, advertise it on this group, or just whatever. But if those are not active leads that really have an active audience, then that's just spinning wheels.
Yeah, or if it's not the right audience, or if it's not the right time. There's so many things that factor into that, and a good publicity house will understand that. And so here's what you need to do. Is if someone is promising good publicity services, you need to get references from them, and you need to know exactly what they're going to do with your book, what's going to happen, what the cost is going to be, and what you can expect from that. And I'll tell you, 95 times out of 100, you could do it yourself, or it's just not worth your money, especially when you're talking $3,000 for someone who's an emerging author, right? You want to have something more that you can count on.
I think you have to do a cost analysis too.
Exactly.
You need to ask yourself, how many books do I need to sell in order to cover that $3,000? Because if you need to sell, I don't have my calculator with me, but if you if each book costs you $2 to print and to send to them, because it looks like from your question, you have to send them copies of the book. So if each book plus your shipping is costing you $250, then how many books are you going to have to sell in order to cover that $3,000? Because then you'll start making money. So
yeah, $3,000 is a lot of money when you're talking, about an independently published author. So, so you do want to make sure that is worth it. So here's the thing that we've generally found: if a company is offering to publish and publicize your book, it's probably not what you're wanting to do. Usually you want to have someone, like you want to find someone that just specializes in publicity. And that's who you'd want to go with after you've completely vetted them, because even that can be a challenge. Now, that's not to say that there aren't services out there that can both publish and publicize your book and do a good job with it. So, you can't make blanket statements on these things. But again, I would say 95% of the time that's the case. I very, very rarely would ever encourage anyone to use a service like this, just because so many of them aren't good, unfortunately.
The other caution that I would give on this is to make sure if you do ask for references and they provide you references, make sure that the references they provide you are of people who are at the same place in their career.
Yes.
So if they write back to you and they say, well, we've done work for John Grisham. Well, that's great, but John Grisham is going to sell 1 million copies because he's John Grisham and he's been in the market for 20, 30 years, 20, 25 years. Find someone that is another indie author or a person who maybe has 1 or 2 books out, if that's the level that you're at, if that's where you're at in your career, and this is your first book or your second book. Just make sure you see what those people are doing. Because, they may come back and give you these great numbers, but if the author has a huge following, then they may have gotten those numbers because of the author's following, not because of anything that they did, and you want this company to work for you.
So, in short, good job, Maria, for not just going along with it, but for questioning it and seeking out answers for this, because too many authors don't, and I think you're going to find that because you did question it, you're going to have many better options out there.
Yeah, so that's great.
All right. Well, thank you all for watching. If you have any questions, we'd love to hear them. Just send them to @WritingMomentum on Twitter or through any other social media service. And we would love to answer your questions in a future podcast or just directly. We love helping writers. That's what we do. So thanks for watching Writing Momentum.
Bye, guys.